out my window, many sights to see. When I look in my window, so many different people to be, that it's strange, so strange. You got to pick up every stitch. You got to pick up every stitch. You got to pick up every stitch. Must be the season of the witch. Must be the season of the witch. Oh, must be the season of the witch.
Hello everybody, this is WhyBoy here, and welcome back to the Team Yume podcast. And as always, I'm crashing the party here, because I'm WhyBoy and I do those sort of things. And the one really hosting this is our wonderful host, Madhog himself. Say hello, Madhog. Beautiful, beautiful. That's how you say hello. Now we got a whole list of topics just all ready to talk about. And this time I'm actually prepared for most of them to say my piece on them. So that's good for me, because I'm outrageously tired from all my schoolwork and all that jazz. Because it's been a while since I last been on the podcast. Like, I've done short films, I've done other comics, videos. Gone in to talk about, like, racism in videos, so that's been a lot of fun and all that. And now I'm here, and let's get... And now I'm not sure where to go from here.
Okay. Did you get all that out of the system, or do you have some leftover material you want to spew out of your face hole, so to speak? Because you were going great up until that last insy-bitsy moment when you just crashed and burned. You were doing so good. I'm so proud of you.
Well, you put this all on me right away. I'm good at hosting stuff, but I didn't have the material for it.
Don't tell me you are one of those presenters who need to have actually something written for them to do so. Myself, I'm a more of a spur-of-the-moment sort of man. Well,
I would like to prepare beforehand before I do something like this. That's one of the presenters.
Listen, I'm just happy to have you here because it's been too long. It's been too long since the last time we did a proper podcasting show, such as this one. And as you can see, the lighting in the background here still suggests that I am about to ascend to the celestial gates. Even though I removed the mirror, which does a fantastic job in really making me look like I am Jesus Christ, with my aura of light around me, reflected in said mirror. But yes, the lighting is what it is. I actually enjoy the contrast, the color-coded contrast between the two of us. I'm always wearing black on a luminescent background, and you're always blue on a more color deaf background. Muted color background, I should say.
There's all the stuff there, and just that stuff there. Just a very colorful background, just with blue at the forefront.
Yes. We both have been busy. Hence why this podcast was not available, so to speak, for a very long time. I had a somewhat busy schedule, and WhyBoy had a very busy schedule, and when the two powers of schedules combined, lack of podcast arises. You're still going about that university of yours, aren't you?
Yeah, just my last year of college right now. I'm just about finished up the third term onto the last term of everything, and I'm feeling so good about that. Just trying to get all my ducks in a row and all that. And just trying to actually prepare myself for actually work outside. Trying to do, like, videography gigs. Like, just today, I got myself a Steadicam right here. Yeah.
Ooh,
It's my
props! Yes.
Yep. Yep. Props just for any sort of videography job. Just been practicing around with that. And hopefully we'll try to use that for my own videos as well. Maybe when I go to conventions and all that.
Well, that sounds extremely fine. Anything else?
Other than that, was just like doing short films and all that. Unfortunately, the one that I made didn't win this year, but I was pretty happy because the first one I did last year won. So I can't really complain.
Funny you should mention one of your 48 or 42 hours film contests, because this year I had to deal with something similar. Except I was not one of the people making the film, I was one of the people telling people to make a film. So I was on the other end of the spectrum. So this is an interesting, unique perspective we both have going on. You know, we are from different sides of the same coin, so close but yet so apart.
Yeah, exactly.
I have to contextualize that because, yes, I have been busy myself with the same thing I tend to do this time of the year, every year or so, which is the AS Film Festival, which by now, you might know if you're a long-time listener of our podcast, it's something that I partake every year. Usually it's in December, this year was in November, which was a massive improvement. The AS Film Festival is a festival I work in, not a festival I go to. Like the Future Film Festival, that's the other festival I usually like to talk about. Just so I can avoid confusion here, because, you know, they both have Film Festival in the name, so you might get confused.
Right.
This year's edition, it was the 6th edition. We've been doing this for 5 years. Well, technically, I've only joined the 2nd year. In the first year, I was there in spirit, in the sense that I wrote a rather scathing review of the whole event. Then one thing led to another, and I ended up working with the same people I criticized. Funny how life works out sometimes.
Oh, yeah.
Yikes. Anyway, no hard feelings. I work with these people. I've been working with these people for a long time by now, and I'm friends with most of them. I am part of the main company that produces the festival, which is named Not Equal. We are yet to have a proper website. But anyway, the AS Film Festival does have a website in both languages. This year's festival was the busiest, the longest, and also the most successful one we've ever had. We had a full house, so a large attendance, far more than the allotted space we were afforded could handle, which is inspiring, I must say. The venue we use for the festival is a quite prestigious one. It's an important international museum for the arts of the 21st century, located in the capital city of Rome. That's where we go every year. It's an important venue, and this year finally paid off.
Nice.
Now, the festival itself is technically no profit, but if people want to support the event by buying our merchandise, that's a-okay by us. Now, the event happened last week, but I'm still tired from it. Mostly because I was under the weather before it, I was under the weather during it, and I'm still technically under the weather as we speak.
Right.
I feel a bit weird and wobbly in the inside. It's as if a virus is trying to get in, but it's too fat and it gets himself stuck at the entrance door. So it feels like I am always at the cusp, at the brink of getting sick, but I'm never really truly getting sick. It's just enough to have a headache every once in a while. Which is annoying.
Yeah.
But anyway, the festival, yes. So we had, as I mentioned before, a little contest much similar to the one in which you participate. It's a 42 hours film contest with very little in terms of rules and obligations, aside from a couple of interesting details. First of all, every film, each of the participants, which were 12 this year, but only 11 actually made it in time, the 12th one simply disappeared from existence. Go figure. Anyway, they had to make a film in 42 hours. That's the nature of the challenge, as you are well aware by now.
So for the actual short films, were there actual like parameters set around what short films you had to make? Because for my short films, we had to basically base ours around like the hero archetypes.
Well, I am getting there. There are no limitations in terms of genre, direction, narrative. They can pretty much do whatever they want to do within the maximum length of 6 minutes. They are free to do whatever they want to. But they are required to somehow shoehorn a sentence in it, a very specific sentence which I'm not going to bother you with, because it's a political reference. And if I have to explain further about that, I am going to be forced to bring up once again the 5-star movement and comedian Beppe Grillo, and I'm pretty sure you are sick and tired of hearing about that by this point. I am sick and tired of talking about it. I've talked about it far many more times than I really wanted, which is to say, one time. More than one time was enough. So anyway, they had to include that sentence, but more interestingly, and this is the kicker here, they had to use a title that we were providing. And as it happens, the titles we gave them, they are titles from pre-existing well-known films. For example, a group did get The Iron Giant, E.T., and so on and so forth. It was interesting, the idea of seeing what kind of bewildering, befuddling, mishmash, hodgepodge, and hogwash these people could come up in their own time, could invent in the allotted time they were granted. And as it happens, the payoff was great for the most part. Now, I'm sure you understand more than anyone else the difficulties of making a film in merely 42 hours. We are not just talking about shooting a film and then taking your sweet time to edit it. No, we are talking about coming up with a basic concept, develop said concept, write a script around said concept, then there is the filming, the shooting, and then there is the editing, and then the film has to be delivered. All of that in merely 42 hours.
Right.
Which is not casually the length of the festival itself.
Yeah, it's a whole lot. Like, I was mainly my group's main editor and sort of the director of the whole thing, so I'd have a lot of the responsibility on my shoulders in the end. Like, I even got to the actual school like 6 a.m. basically just to make sure I was there to hand in the movie on time. Because the issue with my 48-hour film challenge was that they didn't give us all the actual schematics for how they wanted the film to be submitted in. So they didn't give us frames per second, they didn't give us how long it had to be. It basically, they told us they did, but they never did. So everyone was just running around just saying, what do we have to do? They're getting there at 6 to fix that, basically, was just the only way that I could actually make sure that we actually got it in on time.
So you can relate to what these up-and-coming filmmakers had to deal with their own set of restrictions, temporal restrictions, as it were. But the works they have sent to us, they were quite interesting, and the best part of it is that we had no idea what their final product would entail, because the first time we saw those films was at the same time as everyone else. Some of those were quite intriguing and creative. For example, the people who were left with the Iron Giant, they came up with a clever little hook. As in, there is a giant iron statue of a saint somewhere in Rome that apparently it's alive, and it switches body with a aloof idiot that happened to pass by, and he steals his life. And that's the film. That's the Iron Giant. Because you see, they are not tasked to make remakes or parodies. They can make their own original material, but they just have to work with a title that we gave them.
Right.
Oh, and so there was this one film which is based off Vacanze di Natale, which translates to Christmas Holiday. It is the well-known pioneer of the now infamous cinepanettone genre, which you might have heard of.
Yeah, I've partially heard of it, yeah.
Yes, it's rather infamous, and the less I say about that, the better. So they took the concept of the cinepanettone and turned it into a hilariously trashy horror. I'm serious,
Yeah.
I never laughed so hard at anything. It was so good in a bad way, or vice versa. Some were much better produced and edited and overall directed. Some others were not, understandably.
Right.
Arguably, the best one from a technical standpoint was the first one that was shown, which was a pretty funny but also straightforward comedic situation in which a girlfriend has to somehow convince her boyfriend that she did not cheat him, except all of her excuses crumble down before her, so she takes a pill that makes her travel back to time and try that again. It builds over time on that one premise, and it becomes a comedic masterclass in its own right.
Right.
It's pretty funny.
Yeah.
But not as funny as that Christmas-themed trash horror that I already mentioned. And I will never forget, as long as I live, the final scene in which the girl runs out of the door only to find the supernatural Christmas monster serial killer with a small Christmas tree in his hand is basically naked, as he holds the tree, mind you, and he says, "Merry Christmas!" Ah! And then there is a glorious freeze frame on the girl screaming her lungs out, and the title drops. Christmas Holidays. Mwah. Oh, I love this contest, and I love the fact that I was the one who presented this contest, I was the one who gave directions and instructions, I was the one who presented again the winners, or the participants, as it were.
Yeah.
I had a good time getting my histrionic demeanor out there to make the people laugh, and people appreciated that. Smashing success, if I say so myself.
Well, I'm glad it was such a smashing success.
Which is great, because the last couple of editions were so-and-so.
Yeah.
But it's finally paying off this year. It's great. Oh, and before I forget, let me tell you about the section, the segment of the festival that I have personally curated up to this point, which is the animation category. Animation
Right.
Now. You might be interested in learning about the winner of that category this year.
Okay.
The winner was the stop-motion animated film by Tomoki Misato, which is titled My Little Goat. And no, it's not what you think it is. I know the title can be a bit misguiding, I understand that, but it has nothing to do with whatever it is you're thinking right now, and I can tell what you're thinking right now. Stop being so obvious about what you're thinking right now. It's actually a pretty damn good film. Now,
Yeah.
The director, Tomoki Misato, actually is not a newcomer in this festival. His previous work was already featured last year in the last edition of this festival. I believe that was his first work, and already by then he had a recognizable, easily identifiable style that cannot be confused with anyone else. He has a unique brand of stop-motion animation. His character models are very unique in that sense.
Okay.
Now, My Little Goat. Yes, I still cannot believe the international title is My Little Goat, but here we are. It is an interesting take on the classic Brothers Grimm story, The Wolf and the Seven Sheep.
I actually just got the Brothers Grimm fairy tale book just the other day, just for my own sort of reference. I haven't read most of the stories yet, though.
Well, that's a nice coinkydink, I must say. But yes, so The Wolf and the Seven Sheep is one of the lesser-known fables by the Brothers Grimm. So if you're familiar with the stories by the Brothers Grimm, then you certainly know that the subtext for many of those stories tend to be, well, rather grim.
I would definitely like to get into more Grimm fairy tales more, because I do like going to thematic breakdowns and all that sort of stuff. So I haven't gone into Grimm enough to basically figure out the wolf representing in all the stories would be, or if they are all overarching.
I'm going to say this. There is a general critical consensus as to what the wolf represents in the Grimm stories, which I will not tell you about, because that would spoil the outcome of My Little Goat, which is a film I want you to see. But I'm going to say this. The interesting style of the director is always somewhere in the middle between the metaphorical and the literal. And there is an interesting combination of the two aspects that comes out as a result. Because of that, you could see My Little Goat as either an edgier, darker interpretation of the original text, or a actual literalization of the subtext from said text. And already by saying that, some idea in your mind might start to form. And the stories by the Brothers Grimm, let's not mince words, they are already pretty dark in their own right. They are grim, after all, but usually the more dicey aspect of those fables lies in the subtext. They tend to be repackaged to be appealing for kids.
Right.
What My Little Goat does is doing away with the pretense and showing the true disturbing and concerning nature of those stories, while also creating some new interesting subtext in the process. There is a lot to be said about this story that is not explicitly said, but on the other hand, there is so much about this story that's explicitly just thrown onto your face that you cannot escape it. I fully recommend it. It's interesting, it's scary, it's disturbing, it has an atmosphere to it, and you don't know what's going to happen next. It demands your attention. It grabs your attention as if to strangle it. It's intense.
Really interesting, yeah.
And I really like his animation style. Like I said, it's very identifiable and recognizable. So you should definitely check this out. It takes the original metaphor of the Grimm's fable and it lays it bare for all to, I was going to say enjoy, but that might be a strong word.
Right.
For all to see. Yes, let's go with that.
Definitely want to look it up after the podcast and give it a watch.
I happen to read a certain comic on my phone when I had free time during the festival, so consider this a very clunky segue to our next topic, which is a comic. And we have not reviewed a comic in some time, have we?
It's been quite a while now.
Let's fix that. Let's definitely fix that. Me and WhyBoy, we both read Sandra and Woo, which is a 10-year-long webcomic.
Yeah, they've been expanding too. They have their own books now. They have a video game. And
Yes.
Sandra and Woo is still...
The less we say
keep
about the
going.
video game, the better, by the way.
Yeah.
I've seen how it looks. It's not very pleasant to observe, I must say. Maybe it's a good game, but if the graphics are an indication or the voice samples I had the misfortune of hearing, well, no thank you. But yes, it's actually a very big comic. It's one of the most interesting and fascinating success stories in the market of independent comics. So first of all, how much have you read about it?
From rereading it, I'm on... Let me just double check, because I just actually saved the number. I was at comic number 614. That's 614 out of 1,035. So I got quite through it.
Wow, that's impressive. It's impressive how fast you managed to read this comic since I asked you to read it, which was at the beginning of the week.
Yeah, and I really couldn't work on it at the beginning of the week because I was handing in a few different things, setting up corporate video shoots and all that sort of stuff. So I mostly just read this on the bus ride back and forth from school. Well, I got through it pretty well.
Wow, it's so similar to my own experience. I've only managed to read this comic in between breaks as I worked at the festival. It is a surprisingly easy to consume read. It's very easy to read, is what I'm trying to say in the least intuitive way possible.
It really is. It's sort of a mixture of that feeling when you read Calvin and Hobbes, where it has like some goofier comics, some more thoughtful comics. But more than Calvin and Hobbes, it feels to me it almost takes a step above that, since that it has some sort of like dramatic comics as well, and it also talks about like certain interesting topics that Calvin and Hobbes would never touch upon.
Yes, interesting topics. I have a lot to say about everything you just mentioned right now. Because I like this comic overall, and I will definitely continue reading it in the future. I'm all caught up, by the way. I've read everything there is to read up until this point. And so I have formulated a few thoughts about it, a few criticisms here and there, a few ponderings, so to speak. I have mixed feelings about it overall, is what I'm saying right now. But they are not easy or simple issues to point out here and there. It has to do with the very way the comic presents itself every so often. It has to do with the very identity, or shall we say lack thereof, that this comic seems to sport, or not sport, depending on your perspective. First of all, let's discuss about the art style, the aesthetic and presentation. What did you think of the art style?
Just looking at the most recent comic right now, like I get a lot of the feelings like when I read original like Dennis the Menace sort of comics, like very simplistic sort of human features, human faces. It gets across the motions of the comics like very well, and I get a lot of the expressionism. And definitely when you go back to like Sandra and Woo and their little adventures and all that, there's a lot of cuteness, a lot of oh yeah, sunshine and rainbows and all that, and you get a lot of that sort of like emotion from it that I'd look for when I find comics myself. So this is really up my alley when it comes to art styles for me.
Monocle on. Expressionism does not mean what you think it means.
Well, I'm more talking about the
I know you were talking about the facial expressions and features and how they convey emotions.
Yeah,
but
I
you
didn't
said
say
expressionism. No, you literally said expressionism. I'm calling you out on that. I have it on record.
I didn't say expressionism. I said expressions.
No. You said expressionism. Like I said, it's recorded and it's inescapable. You called it modern art movement. You compared it to that.
I didn't say expressionism. I may have just slurred my words at the end, but I was saying expression.
Okay. Mercilessly teasing you aside, which is so amusing. My gosh. And it will never not be funny. I like the art style as well. We should have said this at the beginning of this review, but the comic is illustrated by Indonesian artist Pauri. Now, from what I could see of this artist on their DeviantArt account, they are mostly a furry artist, a really good high-quality furry artist. If you take a look again at their DeviantArt account, you will find really high-quality paintings. Already, even before I took a look at their resume, so to speak, I could notice that the aesthetic presentation was deceptively simple. There was a hidden complexity in it, beneath the cutesy, very simple character models of both the humans and the animal characters, because, yes, there are anthropomorphic animal characters in here. Shockable shock! I know, I just said they're furry artists. But anyway, so it still manages to get across the intended emotion or the intended humor that a given comic strip wants to convey. It is perfectly functional to the writing, and it is appealing on a fundamental level. Clearly, they have many inspirations, many direct or indirect inspirations. Anime clearly being one of those, but then again, what comic or animation nowadays doesn't take some sort of inspiration from anime? That's like saying, hey, there is oxygen in the atmosphere. Yeah. It's a bit of an obvious statement, and a really generic and too broad one to properly contextualize it. But yes, the art style is good, and this comic looks nice. It is easy to see why it can be commercialized, why it can be successful. It has a cute, clean art style that's widely appealing, and that makes it easy on the eye for a much more broad audience. So good on them.
Yeah.
Now, the writer and, shall we say, main creator of this series is a German programmer by the name of Oliver Knörzer. I'm not sure how to pronounce it, but there you go. I have some issue with the writing here and there. Rather, I have some issues with how a lot of the characters are presented and how a lot of the humor is presented and how a lot of the more adult commentary is presented overall. But to properly contextualize my feelings for it, I think it would be more appropriate if we discussed what this comic is about in the first place. Logically.
Yeah.
So, Sandra and Woo is the tale of the many perils and other shenanigans of a 11 to 13 years old girl by the name of Sandra and her pet raccoon, which can talk, obviously, because it's a comic. So, there is a talking animal. Its main inspiration was clearly Calvin and Hobbes, as the comic itself goes out of its way to homage. But that is only the case at first, and I'll get to that. But yes, the premise is that she adopts this raccoon, which was being mistreated by the previous owner, and now they have adventures together. The raccoon has his own circle of friends in the wild animal forest, which is right beside the suburban town. The girl has her own set of wacky friends to deal with, and a lot of the situations inevitably come from these characters interacting. It's really a typical comic, a typical strip comic in that sense. There are funny scenarios and occasionally serious arcs that don't really intersect well together, if you ask me. More on that later. There is a lot of things to address by now. You have the two main characters. Sandra is a nice, dorky girl. The raccoon is also somewhat dorky. Then there is the boyfriend character, which I'll get to in a minute. And then there is the best friend character, which I'll also get to in a minute. And a lot of other elements are present here as well. I am being obnoxiously vague, I realize that, but there is a good reason for that. Oh my gosh, this comic. So every once in a while there is a social and political commentary that falls as flat as a tire, if you ask me. And there is also a surprising amount of mythology and lore being thrown in, to the point that you might wonder why this writer and this artist didn't just make a high fantasy comic, which they did, by the way. It's titled Gaia, yes, it's their other comic, which is a proper fantasy. I am all over the place.
In terms of writing, I like it overall. There are definitely some bits where I'll just spoil random things because they're out of context entirely. There's a raccoon god that shows up at one point, then it's basically gone. And then there's like this really famous raccoon, and then they're gone. And they're basically just a lot of...
The famous raccoon, by the way, resurfaces in one of the latest comics.
Yeah.
Also, the god raccoon is actually a much more recurring character later on. Because, yes, as WhyBoy just so casually said right now, there is a raccoon god. But that's not the only thing that this comic has. Oh, no, 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 no. You see... As soon as the raccoon god appears, which already feels a bit out there considering up to that point, this strip has been mostly grounded in terms of humor or context. Yes, there is a talking raccoon, but that could still somehow be included in a more magical, realistic setting. Like I said, Calvin and Hobbes. But then the raccoon god appears, which I believe is based off of some deeply researched mythology. The writer goes out of his way to actually reference the Voynich manuscript. I'm not sure that's how you pronounce it. The Voynich manuscript, which is a mysterious cryptographic text that was written in the 15th century, and several studious people and scholars had not been able to decipher it up to this day. He took the writing style of the Voynich manuscript and created his own intranslatable manuscript to detail the mythical lore of the raccoon race. So all of a sudden, this went from Calvin and Hobbes to Watership Down in a heartbeat. So we have a cartoon talking animal, various shenanigans, and then all of a sudden the raccoon goddess is introduced, and then the comic uses the raccoon goddess to springboard us into a full-on pantheon of gods, animal gods, which also include the regular god of Christianity, which is named Thomas J. God. Oh, and by the way, yes, in a later arc, perhaps the most outlandish arc that this comic produced, which is titled The Divine Comedy, yes, it's a direct reference to Dante's La Divina Commedia, but it has nothing to do with it. Thomas J. God is killed by Odin, and then the raccoon goddess has to find a replacement for God, and she finds a guy, which I believe is named John, and he becomes John God, but then later on, John offends Fortuna, the devil's sister, and so Fortuna produces a Eldritch Cthulhu-esque Lovecraftian abomination from her mouth, which eats the head of John God, and as of now, humanity has no god. So, as you might have noticed by me trying so hard to describe to you certain minor happenings of the comic, you might have guessed by now that this comic is all over the place. It cannot settle for a tone, it cannot settle for a genre, it cannot settle for an identity. This feels as if the writer had so many interesting and curious, weird and creative ideas for his comic, and he ended up implementing them all into this comic. And the end result is one of the most outlandish, and yet also one of the most frustrating comics that I have read in a long time. As out there and blasphemous as the religious commentary gets, ironically, it does not have enough of a bite to actually count as satire. Oh, the writer would like you to think it's doing satire, but it really isn't. Like I said, it's too unfocused, it's too ridiculous, and it's too vague.
Yeah.
Satire has focus. Satire provides a commentary about something specific using the tool of comedy. This doesn't have much of a meaning outside of a very self-serving, look at me, I am making fun of religion for making fun of religion's sake. That's how it reads to me. And sadly, it's not even all that funny. It's too outlandish to be funny. It's too generalized and unfocused to count as satire. I suppose they make fun of the classic work environment by comparing God's work and all the other gods as simple employees in a big company. But that has been done so many times, it doesn't really count as edgy anymore. The attempts at being subversive and providing social and political and religious commentary, all of that is rather weak. It's a rather weak aspect of the comic, and unfortunately it's an aspect of the comic that's brought up a lot of times. I think it's the most ambitious part of the comic, but it isn't the best part of the comic. It takes away from what should be the focus of the comic, which is to say, the characters. In the middle of the Divine Comedy arc, the comic suddenly decides to become Homestuck in the middle of it. There is no rhyme or reason to do so, they just wanted to do an homage, but it's frankly unwieldy to follow at that point, just as Homestuck is unwieldy to follow. So personally, I don't like it that much. It doesn't do it for me.
Throughout all the arcs, it definitely does sort of switch between genres and styles so rapidly. There's not really a set tone, basically. Really just hold you onto it. For me, the strongest tone that is consistent through all the arcs that I've read so far, except Calvin and Hobbes sort of feel, it's Sandra and Woo. Those two are still the strongest characters. When it focuses on just, like, little kid adventures, little girl growing up and all that, those are the strongest written moments. When it gets into God stuff, when it goes into more of the, like, animals outside and all that, those stuff seems a little bit disconnected and all that. You know, I do like the fact that when we talk about, like, animals outside, there is a little bit of the darkness of it where Woo will actually eat animals just on panel. Just Sandra and Woo are just looking at a bird. She's like, "Oh, cute bird." Woo goes up, chomps its head off, comes back down. You ruined nature, Woo.
Yes, that's also a little bit of a contention. All the animals in this world, they are sapient. They talk. And yet the food chain works just as normal. And this feels very messed up, which is the intended feeling we are supposed to feel, but I'm not sure I find it funny. For example, Woo is friends with a fox by the name of Shadow and a squirrel. They are constantly, and I do mean constantly, teasing the squirrel that they were going to eat him. Always. They still do. They never stop doing that one single joke over and over and over again. It wasn't all that funny the first time, but by the 150,000th time, it's downright annoying. That should not be a punchline for your strip comics anymore. Frankly, it's a bit disconcerting at this point. Although, I will say this, one of my favorite characters in this comic is a character that has been very wisely underutilized. A squirrel that hunts predator with a magnum gun.
Yeah.
Wow, she hunts them down, kills them, and she eats their flesh.
Yeah.
Okay, listen. We've talked about gods, attempts at satirical religious commentaries, animals eating other animals, psychotic squirrels. I feel that all of these elements should have had their own comics, separated from the adventures of Sandra and Woo. And this brings us to what is the main problem of the comic, finally, to make a roundabout point. It tries to be too many things. And it has too many characters and too many situations involving said characters that really should warrant their own stories and their own comics. Maybe happening in the same universe, but not literally in the same comic, because as it happens, the tone is inconsistent, the presentation of the narrative is also inconsistent. Sometimes we would have a traditional 4-panel comic structure, but then we would switch to a more serious arc, and in that sense it becomes more of a traditional modern webcomic with no punchline at the end of a strip. But sometimes you also had something in the middle, like, again, the Divine Comedy arc, which has become the bane of my existence by now, which both has an ongoing ridiculous narrative, but also has a punchline at the end of every strip.
Right.
But again, too many cooks. And we haven't even talked all that much about Sandra and Woo themselves, because honestly I think they get overshadowed by everything else in the comic. You have a raccoon goddess, which is a very interesting character in her own right, if you ask me. She always seems to hang with her people. She is one of them. She's a very down-to-earth goddess, which I find amusing. And then there is that other raccoon you mentioned earlier, by the name of Butterfly.
Yeah.
She has only one arc dedicated to her. She's apparently the chosen messiah of the raccoon race. The goddess herself went out of her way to make sure she gets conceived by her parents. Honestly, it feels like she should be the star of her own comic more than anyone else. And personally, I think she is the best character. And again, this is supposed to be a comic about a friendship between a girl and a raccoon, but there is so much more to the world that surrounds them that it dwarfs the premise itself in comparison. I would rather be much more interested in seeing what Butterfly is doing. Is she actually going to climb the K2 mountain after overcoming her fears of heights, or I should say her stage fright? Yes, that's what her problem was in her original arc. Apparently, the end of the dinosaurs was caused by one of the animal gods not doing his job properly at the office that one time. That seems like the sort of joke and situation that should be in a novel by Terry Pratchett, if you ask me. And then you have the human side characters, and we are finally going to talk about them because, oh boy, do I have so many things to say about them. So let's start with the more egregious note. Let's talk about Cloud. Yes, there is a kid, a character by the name of Cloud. And already that should send little alerts down your brainwaves, because yes, yes they should. Cloud. If you look at the dictionary, at the very definition of a self-insert character, you have a picture of Cloud. He somehow, inexplicably, cross-checks every single element that defines a self-insert character. The very specific kind of self-insert character that has plagued the landscape of online literature since the mid-2000s, both in comics and fanfictions, ever since anime nerds started to write anything, really.
For me, Cloud is definitely just sort of that generic, just sort of like, I'm just a nice guy and all that. I didn't really get myself the self-insert sort of part of it, because I don't really know much about like the actual creators enough to really see that.
Okay, I'll tell you this. The funny thing about Cloud is that he's presented as a traditional, obnoxious, self-insert OC. There is no denying that. He has a milquetoast, nice guy personality. All the women find him cute and they want to kiss him or cuddle him or do much worse to him. He is 12, by the way. He gets teased and he gets all flustered when he gets teased about how popular he is with girls. Oh, no, leave me alone. I'm not that popular. He's perfect boyfriend material, and also he's a master of the sword because he was trained by his mother, which is also a master of the sword, and he has several out-of-place action scenes with either people or animals alike. He is very much the quintessential insert OC, to the point that I almost thought, given the nature of the comic, that they were self-aware about it. He was meant as a parody of that trope. But it is not really presented as a parody. It is presented as genuine. If the parody was the intent, they did not do a good job in making it clear that it is a parody, because they didn't go overboard enough with that, which is ironic because they go overboard with pretty much anything else.
Right.
So it was just enough of him for me to hate and find incredibly obnoxious, because his only personality trait is nice, and that's boring. But incredibly enough, he is not the writer's self-insert OC. No, the writer's self-insert is Sandra's father, whom is also a programmer.
Yeah.
That's very blatant. By his own admission, that guy is his self-insert. Which is why I would buy in a narrative in which Cloud was intended as a parody of that particular trope that plagues comics on the internet. But they did not do a good job at that, so it just became another one of them.
Yeah, I can totally see that, because it obviously it started off as just a sort of a Final Fantasy parody with just the name Cloud and all that. He knows how to use the sword because his first appearance is basically a bully picks on a kid. It's just like, oh, like Cloud only has a small knife on him. He can't do anything with that. It's like, oh, the keyword was only had a knife, and the bully has all his clothing ripped up by him. Just like, oh, he's so perfect. He can use a little butter knife.
Yes, you know, they toned down that aspect of him in later comics, thank goodness. There are no more scenes of Cloud looking like God's gift to women anymore. Because apparently they must have realized it's pointless, and most of all, it's boring and predictable, and it doesn't fit with the original premise. But then again, what does fit with the original premise? Am I right?
Yeah.
In another comic, Cloud would have been the unquestionable main character, and the comic would have been a snorefest. As it is, Cloud is just the perfect boyfriend archetype. To Sandra, specifically. Yeah. Which is also annoying, but is a bit more tolerable as of late.
Yeah. To me, when you bring up that point, it almost brings to the point of what Cloud is entirely, or what the whole world that Sandra and Woo are in.
What is the world? That's the thing. It's a very interesting world, full of lore and mythology and a lot of elements, but they don't coalesce together well. That's the problem.
Yeah, it seems like the explosion of a child's imagination in a lot of ways, because a lot of the arcs are basically Sandra in her own imagination. Like she'll put down on her cape and all that sort of stuff, and be the queen and all that in some of them. And then she'll be a detective in others.
When that happens, it's great, because it is clear it's a flight of fancy.
Yeah.
But no, then you have several other arcs that don't involve Sandra and or Who at all. And they just go so far out in the reaches of space, it's unrelatable.
Right. Oh yeah, I'm not talking about those arcs. Like, I feel that those arcs are the most boring arcs. When it focuses on Sandra and Woo and more their adventures, that's the most interesting stuff. And even when Cloud comes in, I feel Cloud in a lot of ways is like that perfect boyfriend for Sandra, because that's how Sandra sees him. So perfect in every way. He'll save Woo for me and everything.
It would make sense if we only saw Cloud from the point of view of Sandra, but we have several comics in which Cloud is undeniably the protagonist, in which case he gets teased by his family, his mother, whom is some sort of terrorist, refugee, secret agent, I am not quite sure on that, and his sister, which is a mad scientist and a Bond villain waiting to happen, which is also its own recurring gag. Even when he's compared to his own family members, he comes across as so boring.
Right, yeah. It's just a little bit hard, because if the comic was more focused on just sort of like Sandra's viewpoint of the world, just more like just exactly what Calvin and Hobbes was, just basically a child's viewpoint of the world and their thoughts on it.
Well, maybe that's the problem. Maybe that's the issue here. We hit the nail on the coffin. The author made it abundantly clear that Calvin and Hobbes was his major inspiration, but at the same time it is also clear that he did not want his comic to live in the shadow of its inspiration. He wanted his comic to soar, to become its own entity, and in a very confused and somewhat confusing way, it managed to accomplish just that, because in spite of everything, it's still an enjoyable comic. So let's talk about what I can only assume should have been the star of this comic. Because this character, the way she is portrayed and the way she is characterized, you're either going to love her or you're going to hate her. I find it hard to see a midway point. Some time ago, I left you a creepy, mysterious message on Facebook that said, "Beware of the blonde one."
Yeah.
Okay, so
I enjoy her personally, because I have been around those sort of people before.
Yes,
she felt most realistic in a lot of ways. Except for the Bond villain stuff that she had.
Much like most of any other character in this comic, she should have had her own comic. Because I think her own comic would have been a lot funnier.
Yeah.
But instead, she's in this comic, and, well, it's a hit or miss for me in regards to her. So let's address the Larissa problem. Larissa is Sandra's best friend, and for a time also love rival for the attentions of Cloud, but that does not last, thankfully. Let's see, she has a relatively strained relationship with her parents. She doesn't call them mom or dad, she calls them by name. And this very strained relationship is played mostly for comedy, which I find problematic in some aspects, but I can see the comedy in it. Don't get me wrong. I don't want to be a stick in the mud. Let's see. The best way to describe her is... precocious. Now, I don't have a problem with a character that's inherently confident about their sexuality and about what they want to do in that department. I don't have a problem with a promiscuous character. I don't have a problem, in other words, with a character that celebrates sex and her sexuality. However, I have a bit of a problem with a character who does all that and happens to be 12. The main cast, they're all middle schoolers. And middle school is that time in a kid's life in which they discover themselves. They discover their orientation. In some cases, they discover the real gender. They make all sorts of discoveries about themselves as puberty kicks in. So it is perfectly normal for a kid that age to start to have dirty thoughts, the hormones goes wild, they start to openly address what it means to have sex, because they are curious about it, and that's natural, that's realistic. If I recall, one of the many positive points that critics have commented about this comic is that they get what kids of that age are like. They get what their psychology is, and it gives them a realistic portrayal. I couldn't disagree more, because in the same comic in which you would have a quote-unquote realistic portrayal of a middle schooler discovering their sexuality, you also have the same middle schooler, we are still talking about Larissa here, going around with cartoon flamethrowers. Oh, and also we have cartoon animals, we have gods and wacky shenanigans, and we also have an entire arc in which Larissa teams up with the devil who promises to make her a succubus one day. And that would be the Divine Comedy I mentioned earlier. This is the comic we have here. This is not the comic in which a quote-unquote realistic portrayal of a middle schooler really fits in, because it is not realistic to begin with. And so, in this context, I don't really want to hear or read about jokes, very explicit adult sex jokes, coming out of the mouths of kids. I'm sorry, I draw my line on the sand there. That's a bit problematic. And Larissa is a problematic character for a variety of reasons. For example, one of my favorite, and at the very same time least favorite gags about Larissa is that she posts a naked picture of herself to send to her boyfriend, but she accidentally sends it to the entirety of the North American continent. And because of that, 50 million people get arrested because they are in possession of child pornography. The joke works in theory, it's funny, the timing is perfect, and that's probably the only time the writer's attempt at a satire actually works out fine. But Larissa is still a 12 or 13 years old girl, and the joke is literally about child pornography. I don't feel particularly comfortable with that. I hope you can understand and relate to my plight here.
Well, I personally haven't gotten to that joke yet, but
Oh, I'm sorry that I spoiled you then.
Yeah. I'm just trying to think, because there, like what we were talking about before, how there is just sort of like the comic is all over the place. But where I feel like where it is more on point personally is with just sort of the kid characters, because they do talk to me like how I used to talk when I was their age, how I used to talk about like sex and all that sort of stuff, because you talk about it like you know it, then you talk about it like you don't know it. It's basically that sort of like mishmash of a time and all that.
Yes, but that's the problem. That's the problem with Larissa. She does know what she's talking about. She's very knowledgeable on the subject. She's obsessively knowledgeable on the subject. And also she's obsessed with fire, which she understands at a scientific level, to the point that she hosts a convention about it at some point. And yet, at the same time, coming out of the same character's mouth, we also have very complex philosophical thoughts that a kid of that age would never realistically say or think about, unless they are a child prodigy. And this is where, again, the attempt at a realistic portrayal of a kid of that age clashes with everything else, and it doesn't work out.
There is also a point of saying, like, Calvin, as a littler kid, wouldn't be able to say half the stuff that he said way back then. Talking about, like, economic issues, societal problems, and he's making that as a 6-year-old, too.
Yes, but this actually brings a spotlight to another problem. Calvin was used by the writer as a vehicle to convey some of his opinions, obviously, and I have nothing against that. The Peanuts have been doing that since the beginning of Peanuts. The problem is that you cannot coalesce that use of your character with the other use of your character, which is, as I said before, trying to have a kid of that age act in a realistic manner. The two elements don't collide well with each other, much like almost every other element of the comic. In fact, I would argue that the character of Larissa is a microcosm of what doesn't work in the comic on a broader range.
Well, I don't think that's entirely true, because Calvin dealt with a lot of stuff that was like for real kids sort of thing, like bullying, even stuff with like his next door neighbor Susie and all that. There were more real life things that he dealt with, but then it also flipped on the other side. I was talking about like the real world economics and all that, and talking about like a big world scale as well. He basically was a vehicle for the author, as well as also just the vehicle saying like, this is how kids see the world in the real world. So there is ways to basically balance that.
That works for Calvin and Hobbes, but for me at least, that does not work in this comic. And also, I just don't want to hear, on a principle, I don't want to hear 12 years old or 13 years old talking about having explicit sex with their partners, because at some point, that's what's on the plate. The writer tries to have his cake and eat it too, so it's trying to be Calvin and Hobbes. It's trying to be a more raunchy adult comedy, and also everything else in the middle. There is a lot to say about Calvin and Hobbes in terms of subtext. That's because the line between fantasy and reality is very blurry. Hobbes is not real, he's a product of his imagination. So of course, in the realm of his own imagination, as he's talking to an imaginary tiger, he can sound like the smartest person in the world. In Sandra and Woo! Woo! Baby, woo! It is explicitly a world in which reality and fantasy are merged together, and the only times you can say for certain that something is the product of the fertile mind of Sandra is when she dons her detective outfit or her empress outfit and they just play pretend, and she just play pretend with the raccoon. But even that actually stretches a bit far, and it becomes about cereals being discontinued and a crazy cultist that wants to sacrifice her to an elder god. And once again, reality and fantasy mixed together, and that's why this doesn't work as well as in Calvin and Hobbes. That's why it feels out of place to have moments of grounded, quote-unquote, realistic sex talk between middle schoolers, and moments in which they just become the mouthpieces of the author opinion, as well as all of the other scenarios. It's because, again, of the framing of the entire scope of the comic. Calvin and Hobbes is tight and tightly written and presented, and that's why it can get away with all of the things it gets away with. Sandra and Woo is not exactly on that level, even though it tries both to be Calvin and Hobbes and to escape Calvin and Hobbes by implementing this all high fantasy lore in a setting that has no business possessing a high fantasy lore. And at this point in time, I am going in circles. I think I made my point abundantly clear as to why this comic has flaws.
Yeah.
I hope, at least, because I was all over the place, much like the comic itself.
Yeah,
But yes, Larissa.
I can definitely agree with you on a lot of your points. It's just for me personally, I felt like the core idea of Sandra and Woo was able to hold itself well enough to basically, I can understand like the middle school characters having those sort of sexual talks and all that, and I see that more at the mouthpiece and as well as for the realistic conversations myself. Like I find the God stuff personally boring because it is just sort of so disconnected from the kids. Because the kids and Woo are the most interesting parts of the comic for me. And I just sort of like, when God comes up, it's like, skip, skip, skip.
Yes. It's a bit too out there for what was essentially a descendant to the tradition set by Bill Watterson.
Yeah.
Larissa as a character is infamous in her own circle. She is basically a terrorist at this point. She's a danger to everyone and anyone, and she's unchecked, and she's allowed to do whatever she wants to do without restraint. But then, something ridiculously sudden occurs. It is mentioned, casually might I add, casually mentioned at the end of one strip that she has a rare ailment that will cause her to go blind and die by the age of 20. The way this revelation is presented, it had no build-up, it had no successive impact on the narrative whatsoever, it doesn't even affect the tone, to the point, in fact, that I thought she was just joking around, so it didn't even register in my mind that that's the reason why she can get away with everything. So instead of exploring that very real tragedy and give the character some proper depth, the comic just proceeds to forget about that and continue on as if nothing game-changing was revealed. Why would you do that? This is the most egregious aspect of the comic. It doesn't know how to properly manage its own tone depending on a situation. Sometimes it does, like for example everything having to do with Woo and his mate. That is showcasing the appropriate tone. But character has a life-threatening disease and she's using that disease as an excuse to act out on everyone in the world, and the comic just blatantly ignores that and continues on with funny jokes about sex and about setting things on fire, because ha 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 ha, that Larissa sure is a card. She's so funny, and there is definitely nothing inherently tragic about her character worth exploring. Comedy comic.
Yeah.
Yes, that's a bit of a problem, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yikes.
Yeah.
Thoughts?
I haven't read that far in the comics, so I don't really
Again,
have
I'm sorry that I spoiled it to you, but it's an important milestone that gets completely buried by the comic itself.
Yeah.
Unless, of course, she was actually kidding, but the comic didn't have even a follow-up to that joke, so I have to assume it was not a joke, it was a real thing.
Mm-hmm.
Tone! Please!
Yeah.
Give me a consistent tone, that's all I'm asking. In spite of all that, I still enjoy the comic, and I would continue reading it in the foreseeable future.
Yeah.
And that's all I have to say about Sandra and Woo!
Yeah, and I basically said everything in between everything you said.
Sorry.
I really did say. Yeah.
Sorry, I guess I was more prepared because I read the entirety of it.
Yeah. Yeah, I enjoyed Sandra and Woo for a lot of it. It's definitely unbalanced in a lot of areas. And for me personally, I would recommend focusing more on the Sandra and Woo characters, because those are like the more centralized, more focused on aspects. When it goes too far out, it becomes a little bit too muddy. So that's just where I would say you would focus on if you started to read the comic yourself.
Also, if you want to read a proper successor to the Calvin and Hobbes legacy, I suggest Heavenly Nostrils. Although I believe that comic is no longer titled like that, but you can read it on GoGo Comics. I don't discourage or dislike the idea that a comic that started off as a more grounded, magical, realistic comedy, in that sense, ended up including so much world building and so many elements and even its own lore and mythologies and gods. I like that. It almost seems like a postmodern reinterpretation of the classic comic strip. If it were handled better, with a more consistent tone and a consistent presentation of the narrative, I think I would have liked it more. But as it is right now, I still enjoy it. I would also recommend to check out the other comic that the duo Pauri and Knirfer are working on, the much more recent and fully colored Gaia. Now that is a proper high fantasy comic that actually gets into an interesting direction as soon as the first act ends, which is good because I was afraid I was reading another fantasy story about a magical school. It is not the case, thankfully. We have too many of those already. Ruby! So that's that. Sandra and Who. It's available for free, as all comics on the internet tend to do. It updates very regularly, twice a week. In fact, I believe its updating schedule is the most consistent aspect of it. I have so many jokes. And yes, that covers it.
Yeah. Sandra and Woo. Like, just go out to see it. You'll hopefully place it, we'll link it in the description below, right?
Probably. So, talking about this comic took away far more time than I initially thought it would. So, I believe we have reached the end of the podcast. We tried to be as in-depth as possible.
And I think we definitely succeeded.
I will, unfortunately, have to end this show on a bit of a downer and sour note. Article 13, everybody.
Oh, you're right,
Should we talk about that? Because it's going to destroy lives, potentially. It's going to give unlimited control to corporations. I mean, more unlimited than it is now.
Yeah.
The wording on the actual article, it is so vague that will allow them to get away with everything, essentially.
Basically, yeah.
And this is a real danger that's far, far more grave than net neutrality could ever hope to be, which is scary. And this might very well become a factual reality by the end of the year. And it will not just affect Europe, it will affect everyone. I can assure you that. Maybe not immediately, but in the long run, this will ruin careers, and more importantly, this will ruin the ability to create content on the internet for people that are not corporations.
Yep. If it's really sad that it's just going around like this. And it's just a simple fact that if it goes through in the EU, it's going to spread out from there, because more corporations all over the world are going to see that this works there, so why not work here and make it work for us. It's a simple fact. So,
I don't know what's going to happen should this amendment effectively pass in the European Parliament, which at this point is a very realistic possibility. Maybe nothing at first, but I expect it would be a slow changing process that will cause so much damage in the long run rather than all at once. But I dread to live in a world that will not allow me to enjoy memes or will not allow me to do most of what I do on the internet.
Yeah.
And that's going to be the same for you. Yes, you watching this right now. And also you nearby him. You. You're all going to be affected by it.
Yeah.
It's hard times.
Very hard times.
And then we're all going to die in 30 years thanks to climate change.
Yeah.
So you can have that on top of everything.
I would say the only advice, because we can't avoid the 30 years from climate change things, like the world is really just screwed in that sense. But for the EU thing, like, go and message your representatives in wherever you are. Just basically go out there and basically say, like, we don't want Article 13, and just try to push for that. If enough of us are just come together and we talk about it, then hopefully it won't pass. It happened with net neutrality, happened with SOPA. It can happen again with this. We can stop it.
Yes, the problem with those examples is that people could not shut up about them on the internet. You could hear about them everywhere and everywhere.
Yep. So
nobody really talks about Article 13 as much as they should. Yeah. And how could they? It doesn't have a sexy presentation like net neutrality.
Yeah, it's just Article 13. That's not sexy at all.
This is how freedom dies. This is how freedom dies. Not with a bang, not with a obvious, blatant act of oppression. With subtle political maneuvering. It's always been like that.
Because they know that the best way to get away with the most evil of acts is by making it very boring.
So hopefully things will be okay. Let's try to be optimistic, and if you live in the European area, you should try to contact your representative and do whatever it takes.
And if you don't, just continue talking about the Article 13. Just make that the trending topic.
Yes, share about it. Do a video like the one we're doing right now. Talk about it. Spread information. It doesn't matter if you have no pool in terms of attention. I mean, we are basically nobodies on the internet, right? But if enough people talk about it on the internet, you know, it's a drop in the ocean. Then we have many drops in the ocean, and we form the ocean. Do you get the analogy? That's us. So, yes, spread information, and let's hope this does not actually come to pass. And even if it does come to pass,
don't be complacent if it actually passes. Raise hell if it passes.
Yes, I mean, it will pass at this rate. I guess we'll see. Well, that's a bit of a Debbie Downer for this otherwise cheerful podcast, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, basically.
Do you have anything lighter to send us out?
The only thing later that I could possibly bring up is like my next video on Toon Green is going to be like how much I hate the first Wreck-It Ralph. That's about as light as I can go.
You're going to die.
Yeah, I most likely will.
You will die a painful death. How dare you, sir? I'm offended.
I'm not allowed to have an opinion. I know that.
I
I should know
hey,
that more
listen,
than anything.
Listen, apparently I am not allowed to hate a show that has Vor in it because its fans will apparently be pissy about it. Go figure that out. Ha! Anyway, the less
I'm
say
not allowed
about
to
that,
point
the
out
better.
racism theming in Zootopia because people like Zootopia. That's just
Well,
the law
I
of the
mean,
internet.
Zootopia openly addresses and fights racism. How can you not talk about racism in a film that's specifically about racism?
Well,
The gall of certain people.
Well, I'll tell you how you can't talk about that because it's about speciesism.
Go to hell! Do you know what an allegory is? Of course you don't. Of course you don't. Who am I talking to? The same people who lament the aesthetic presentation of Thundercats Ho, and the same people who lament that the new She-Ra is not sexy enough for them to masturbate on. Speaking of which, the new She-Ra is one of the best shows I've ever seen, and you should definitely watch it. It's great.
Yeah, that's on my list to it because I just got Netflix recently.
Make
so that's
it
one.
a priority, along with the latest season of BoJack Horseman. I think it's the best animated series of the year for me. It does so many things right, from such a simple high fantasy concept, coming of age, fight the power, queer empowerment allegory that it is.
Yeah.
It's good. It's very good. So yes, I guess that's the light note by which I will hand this podcast. So thank you for joining us, everybody. I have been your host, Madhog and WhyBoy.
And I have been your other host, WhyBoy. Yeah, I hate Wreck-It Ralph.
You are wrong, but it's okay. I forgive you. I forgive you, my son.
My own personal hate is wrong.
It's time for that part of the show in which we do all the plugins. So plug away.
Well, I basically just plugged right now. My Why I Hate Wreck-It Ralph video is going to be coming out in 2 weeks. Then we're going to be doing a video on who is the best Grinch, as we talk about the 2018 new Grinch, as well as the two other
original.
Grinches. Yeah, the original 2000 version. Like, I won't say our answer yet. Yeah, the Jim Carrey Grinch as well. We're comparing all three of them.
Yes, no, I just gave you the answer. The original Grinch, animated by Chuck Jones, is the best. Why even have a discussion? It's pointless. It's the most pointless video in existence.
Well, for one thing, we have a different opinion, maybe.
Oh, you and your pesky different opinions. I'm not liking you today, young man.
And then we have one other video based on the religious movie The Star that came out, I believe, last year.
Oh, that seems fun.
Yeah, it's gonna be fun. Let's talk about religion. That's another thing people love on the internet.
So much fun to talk about religion. Almost as much to complain about a show for having Vor in it. Apparently, you're not allowed to drop off a show after 2 episodes, say what you thought of those episodes, and what you didn't like about those episodes as to contextualize why you stopped watching the show. You can't do all that because people will think, no, you're wrong about everything, you should have watched the entire show in order to have a proper idea of what to criticize. No, I don't have to do anything of the sort. You, on the other hand, need to grow up. Mwah. I'm not giving you specific examples, but I've said too much. Anyway, as for me, well, you can subscribe to the channel by which you are watching this video right now. Click on the notification bell. Follow me on Twitter at Adriano Bordoni1. You can also follow this guy on Twitter at WB Cartoon Corner, or was it Cartoon Corner WB?
Cartoon Corner WB or Toon Grim.
Always written up there. Thank you for watching. Have a good one, everybody. Have a happy December. And have a happy leaked footage and gameplay and game itself of Super Smash Bros. Ultimate. I feel sorry for that Sakurai person. and I feel sorry for all the people that Nintendo will target as a result of this, even though they might not be guilty of it. And I feel sorry for all of us when Article 13 will literally ruin lives. Yay. Good night.
Good night.